All right, hello and welcome everybody to this afternoon's meeting. We have a very special gift for y'all today. We have a wonderful guest speaker event with the current editor-in-chief of the Fordham Law Review, that being Luis del Rosario. And then we also have the future editor-in-chief of the Fordham Law Review, that being Abigail McCabe. Before we get into tonight's guest speaker event and we start hearing some very valuable, some really unique perspectives from both of these amazing individuals, Danielle's going to do a little bit of housekeeping and then we'll get into kind of the real part of tonight's meeting.
Okay, so regarding your rough draft #1 feedback, for those of you who submitted your rough draft last Sunday, you should expect to receive feedback by Monday, March 27th, so this Monday. In the meantime, please continue to revise your draft, particularly work on your citation. For senior editors, your next step includes the instructions for rough draft assignments from co-managing editors. Senior editor attendance is mandatory for senior editor check-in, which will be on April 4th in 2 weeks. And this Saturday, we have a really exciting event. The second Intercollegiate Undergraduate Law Review Conference will be taking place at 1 p.m. This event is virtual, and we're organizing this event with recently published writers from various undergraduate law reviews across the country, and they will present standout notes and articles. And if you have an interest in being a speaker at this event on Saturday, please see Tom after the meeting.
Awesome. All right, so now we're going to get into the guest speaker event with both Luis and Abigail. I guess to kind of start off this event, we're going to turn it over right now to both you, Luis and Abigail. Could you both give us just a very brief introduction to who you are, for maybe especially for Luis, for those of you who didn't get to see you before, and for Abigail, for basically everyone, as this is going to be your first time seeing everybody.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thanks for letting us join virtually. My name is Luis. I'm the current lame duck editor-in-chief of the Fordham Law Review. I went to undergrad at Tufts. I'm at Fordham Law School now, and I was a paralegal before starting law school.
Hi, everyone. My name is Abigail. I'm so excited to meet all of you. As you know, I'm the incoming editor-in-chief. I went to undergrad at Stony Brook, and then I worked in insurance for a little bit before coming to law school, and I'm currently a 2L.
Okay, great. So we're going to kind of go over a few general questions first before we get into some more specifics. I guess kind of the most general that we can approach this with is, what do you two look for in a law review note? Maybe what is some distinguishing characteristics that you see that really set certain notes out amongst others? Or are there any specific, I guess, examples you could give in which you have seen that?
I can start. I think usually for the most part at this level, most people are always doing a lot of work when it comes to notes. I think that much is clear. Everyone puts in a lot of time to doing their research and putting something onto paper. I think the biggest issue that most people have is writing about everything they've done research on in a clear way, and in a way where someone who's never heard about the topic you're writing about can understand exactly everything you're talking about, understand the nuances, understand the history, and understand your argument without opening every single thing in your footnote. So for me, the biggest thing is clarity and structure.
I agree. There are so many interesting things that you can write about. So I think that when you're approaching a piece, you kind of assume that it's going to be an interesting topic. And what's really going to differentiate it is the ease with which you can understand the topic that you're reading about. And that's going to come from the structure of the overall piece, as well as each individual sentence.
Okay, great. And kind of building on that, what do you see as, I guess, the most important things to keep in mind when you're structuring your note, as kind of the manner in which you present the ideas that you're going through really helps the reader understand what they are reading, what is being discussed about generally within the note. What are kind of the biggest tips you can give as far as writers structuring their note and presenting their ideas in a clear and concise manner?
I think that as you're going through your note, it's important to look at each paragraph first and then each individual sentence and make sure that you have an exact idea of what you want to say in that paragraph or in that sentence. It's very easy when you have so much background information to just kind of ramble a bit and just want to say everything that there is to possibly say. But I think that once you really hone what each paragraph and each sentence is directed at, you'll be able to not only convey that more clearly, but also understand how it fits in your overall argument, which will kind of tell you where to put it and how to structure the piece overall.
And I would say too, when you're editing, especially when you're editing, you need to read your piece as if you've never read it before. And you need to kind of always ask yourself, wait, did I just imply something that someone who doesn't know anything about my topic wouldn't understand if I didn't say? Don't skip words. I can't think of an example right now, but it happens a lot. People will just make a conclusion, or, I mean, let's say someone's talking about a case and they talk about a decision by a court where they talked about a statute, and the way in which a court interpreted a statute one way or another. The next sentence can't just be, therefore, the court showed that legislative history is really important. You need to talk about legislative history before you make a therefore sentence. And that's a really quick example, but that happens all the time. And you'd be surprised. I mean, that happens to me a lot, where I feel like I know something so well and it should be so obvious to everyone else. But if someone didn't know what I was writing about, that kind of leap would be fatal to the clarity in the paragraph I was just writing.
And I guess kind of building off of that point, a lot of our writers have just started to take like their outlines and started to form body paragraphs, but a lot of them aren't I guess, as well versed in kind of taking that outline and putting it into a body paragraph form. What kind of ideas can you give to them that would help them bring those ideas that they have, in their minds swirling around and actually put that down into writing?
I can start. I think when I usually have an outline, it's just a mess of quotes and conclusions and thoughts. What you should really be looking into when you're actually writing your paragraphs and the body of whatever you're writing is, how do these things weave together? How do I make sure that thought one and thought two together make sense? You're not just trying to, build like one whole piece. You're trying to make sure that all your thoughts together connect. And so usually when you're writing your outline, you're just trying to think of all the arguments you can make. When you're actually writing, you need to make sure that those arguments connect. And I think I forget who told me this, but one way to make sure that happens is to make sure that every single topic sentence, if someone were to take whatever you wrote and just read the first sentence of each paragraph, they can understand exactly what you're writing just from that. If they just took all the first sentences out, they'd understand your entire argument. That should be your goal.
The way that I sometimes like to think about writing, if I'm feeling overwhelmed by either how much information there is, or once I finally get it back down, how to get it into a paper, is it's sort of shrinking and then expanding and then shrinking again. So you take all of this research and all of these quotes that you have copied and pasted in a Word document, and then you shrink that into an outline where you have just your really killer points. And then you expand that. And for me, I have a tendency to write really long sentences and maybe ramble a bit. So just get it on paper instead of making yourself panic and procrastinating about how you're going to get from an outline to a final piece. Just write. And then when you have that, kind of shrinking it back in again to cut down sentences for clarity and make sure that you have your paragraphs in a way that makes sense.
Yeah, those are some really amazing points, and it really speaks a lot to like what we see, especially as an editorial board, going through the editing process as we're editing, especially kind of the rough draft #1 submissions. I'm gonna ask a few more questions, but I just want to let all of you know that you're free at any time to raise your hand for a question, and we'll ask that to Luis or to Abigail. I guess kind of building on that point that you actually just mentioned, Abigail, with the expanding and shrinking, we see a lot of times that authors will begin to introduce information that is a little bit too extraneous or not necessarily related to the main point of the argument or the main point that they're attempting to make within that respective section. How do you decide between what is absolutely necessary to be included in a paragraph and what can kind of be left out?
I think it goes back to what Luis said about thinking about it from the perspective of someone who knows nothing about this topic. And if I was reading it for the first time and you start going off on a tangent, it's going to completely pull you away from the main point. Even if that information is important information, generally, it may not be important information for you. And I think one way to do that, actually, I spoke to a judge who told me something that I think about a lot. And it's that if you're really emotionally attached to a sentence, it means you're probably going to end up having to cut it. Because sometimes if you have this beautifully worded sentence that just feels so high level and cerebral, it probably is going to end up not being as clear than if you just got to your point. And if you get attached to like a certain sentence or a certain paragraph or a certain portion of your research that ultimately doesn't end up being key to your paper, you have to be okay with letting it go, even if it feels like you put a lot of work into it. So I think separating yourself from it and reading it with fresh eyes, even reading it out loud, as silly as it sounds, really helps.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, when you're reading something, right, you want it to flow. You want things to just, you want to be taken on a journey without any bumps, and you want to have your comprehension grow as you read a piece. If there's something that just really doesn't belong, when you read it as you're editing, or when someone else is reading the piece once it's published, they're going to feel a bump, and everyone's going to think, why is that there? Why is this relevant? And what do I need to understand about this? If that's what happens, then you should probably cut it. And if you're very stubborn and you don't want to cut it, something I see a lot is people will just make it a footnote. So you can reduce it down to a footnote at the bottom of the page, and you can just say, this is an extra idea that I thought was interesting, and if you want to read more about it, you can read about it here. Just don't let it interrupt the flow in the body.
So especially in those situations where something isn't flowing as well, when you're going through and editing it, you notice that it kind of comes off as like a road bump, or just like it feels like it doesn't quite flow as well with like the other ideas are being presented. Is that what you typically tend to see?
Yeah, usually when it's really bad, that's the best way to, well, I guess when it's really bad, you just cut it. When it's less bad, you do a footnote. When it's even less bad, something that you can do is just use grammar as your tools. You can comma something out when something is a little bit of a bump, and you need your reader to like subconsciously think, okay, I'm going to stray from the main point a little bit now with this comma, and there's going to be an offset, and we'll go straight back to the original point after this little phrase. If it's a little bit more of a bump, you can use em dashes instead. And I kind of like to call em dashes a way of using chutes and ladders almost, because if someone wanted the flow to keep going, they can just skip everything in between the em dashes and just move on. So there are a couple of things that you can do.
That's great. And I think we also see this a lot, especially with writers who like to, as you kind of mentioned, like to hang on to things, and either they will try to kind of insert them in any way possible. Would you be able to, I guess you talked about it a little bit already, but possibly expand upon how important it really is for writers to remain flexible as they're going through developing their note, and potentially either they've gone on to develop the note further and they go back and they find that they potentially need to revise a point, to change a point completely, or to potentially, even get rid of that part of their note. Could you touch a little bit on the importance of being flexible as you develop your note, and I guess how to deal with instances in which you need to be flexible?
I think it comes down to a matter of expectations. I think when you're taking on a huge project like a note, you have to go in knowing that your first draft and your last draft are going to look very, very different. And that is normal and it's inevitable. And that's why you start writing early and you set deadlines for yourself and you start by outlining. And then, like I said, rather than trying to make your first draft perfect, because it isn't going to be, just get something on the page and start writing and start your flow. And then from there, you can shrink it back down and you can make it clearer. But I think just keeping in mind that whatever you produce first has a long way to go, and that doesn't make you a bad writer. It means that you're being realistic is kind of the best way to avoid getting too attached to things that may eventually end up needing to go.
Yeah, I learned in 1L that there's like a specific graph to your knowledge where like you start at 0, right? And you start to grow, and you think you know everything. But at that point where you think you know everything, it goes very much down, and then it goes a little bit back up. And that's kind of how knowledge grows. I kind of think writing a note is kind of similar, where you start your research, you know absolutely nothing, you're scared, you don't know what to put on that blank page. You start writing and you're like, okay, I think I got this. And you're writing about everything under the sun. There's a point where you realize that, oh yeah, all this advice that professors have given me, that other writers have given me, that I should talk about ABC all the way to XYZ, doesn't work. You are the person writing about your topic. You're the expert from the research you've seen, and only you really know, only you have the clear picture of what you want your note to be. A lot of people ask for advice in the middle of writing their note, but honestly, when I read drafts, it's just like, okay, it's a little bit of a mess. I don't know where it's going to go, but I trust that you're going to take it there. You're really the only person that can take it there. Like, don't fully rely on someone else in how they tell you what you need to add or what you need to get rid of. Generally, you can kind of follow that, but only you can take your note where it should really go. And that process that Abigail mentioned of expanding and shrinking, I think the shrinking is the most important part once you get to the end. The expanding is like the first hill you get through when you start to do your research, but the shrinking is, the more shrinking you do, the better the note, the better your note will be.
Okay, yeah, those were really amazing insights. Let's see here. We have we're gonna, okay. I guess this one's a little bit more of a specific question. Alex, we'll come back to this one in a little bit. But kind of building on what you were just talking about a little bit more, we see that writers, especially because, most of us, well, actually all of us are not law school students. A lot of us are undergraduates. And we're kind of exploring this idea of legal writing and legal research for the first time, a lot of us for the first time ever, or at least for those of us that have written before. It's kind of a process of rediscovering and improving and working upon that writing each and every time that they do that. How do you think that writers should focus on kind of writing in a legal manner, doing legal writing, but also how to balance kind of their own style or kind of their own method of developing and writing sentences, kind of balancing that legal conciseness while also still having a little bit of, I guess, flavor to what they're saying?
I think that you can do a lot more with a single word than you think, as cheesy as that sounds. I think that rather than using really long, quote unquote, flowy sentences, and by flowy, what I really mean is flowery, sometimes that's where people think that they find their style, is having all these extraneous words and kind of taking on the reader on a journey through one sentence where you don't really know at the end where you started. And I think that that kind of works against you. And I think for me personally, at least, the way that I've kind of maintained my own style is really making sure that each individual word that I'm using very intentionally. And that honestly may take more time than having these really long sentences, because you really need to use each word as an arrow to get to the point that you're trying to get to. And even if sometimes you want to jump to a thesaurus and just spend a little time there finding the perfect word, if you have the time to do that, it can kind of be a way for you to stay concise and stay clear while also feeling like you're putting your whole self into your writing.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, I think a lot of us see so much bad writing that good writing is its own style. And like you should think of writing as trying not to annoy your reader. Like, it's hard enough to get someone to show up to your events. It's even harder to get someone to open a link to whatever you wrote. And if it's 40 pages and the first 2 pages are you like with run-on sentences that I don't know, you're using big words and run-on sentences and you're trying to get fancy with your grammar, they're going to get annoyed and they're going to stop reading. The best writing is the simplest writing. And honestly, the simpler that you have it, the more that like more complicated words or grammar will stand out. And I mean, a lot of judges care the most about simple language. And if you like to write long, a lot of people suggest varying your sentence length. So if you have one really, really long sentence where you're trying to clarify how a court decided something, and you're going to launch next into what another court decided, your next sentence could just say, let's say like the Southern District of New York didn't think so, or like something really short like that, because that really just, after reading a long sentence, a short sentence is like a breath of fresh air, and it gives the person a like pause to start anew and just really keep going. And yeah, I mean, your goal should just be to not annoy your reader, and the best way to do that is having short sentences.
Yeah, that reminds me, I TA for a legal writing class, and one of my students, who's a great writer, and he ended up doing very well in the assignment, came to me in office hours, and he had this argument that was such a niche argument that just didn't really fit. And he was so attached to it, like we were talking about before. And he explained to me eventually, oh, I want to be a rock star. And by that, he meant he wanted to find that one argument that no one else in the class was going to find, despite the fact that they were all writing about the same thing. And the way to be a rock star in legal writing isn't to find the one thing that no one else is going to find, because if no one else has found it, it's probably because it's not important. The way to be a rock star is to get the point that you're trying to make across in the way that's going to be the most digestible to the reader.
Wow, that's really 2 amazing perspectives, I guess, on the overall kind of vibe of what it's like in writing a review, a note. The idea that you don't want to bother people, but at the same time that you want to present something that is well-founded, well-structured, and makes sense. That you're not necessarily always going to be a rock star, and that's kind of something that you should keep in mind as you go through the writing process as a whole. I guess now that those are some kind of more general questions, we're going to just touch on a few more specific questions. Does anyone out there have a burning question that they want to ask right now?
Yeah, not burning.
Well, no. What is it?
My non-burning question, and it really doesn't have a lot to do with this. Are there certain words that you think should be avoided entirely? Sometimes there's often a case where you have several words and you have several options, and one of them is probably the most sophisticated. But it can often be like an issue of clarity. Though it's sophisticated word, but there are other alternatives that are perhaps similar, but not as sophisticated. And when's the right time to use like reading the sophisticated word, and what's the right strategy around that kind of use?
Were you able to hear that?
Yeah, I think so. It's a question about like how to decide when to use a word against another one, especially when it's complicated, or I don't know. Is that the question?
Yeah, more or less that, and then if there ever is an instance when you should choose something that's more complicated.
Yeah. I think the question you ask yourself in those situations is, am I trying to show off or am I trying to make a point? Because oftentimes when people use really big words, it's probably impressive that you know the word and that you're using it, but sometimes someone reading it will just be like, huh? Like, how does that make sense in what I just read? If you know, if your sentence is at a 2 and you use a word that's a 10, and the emphasis of your point isn't at that word, they're going to get displaced and they're going to get confused about what you're trying to say. So again, like, think about it in terms of the flow. And if that is the word that needs to be highlighted there, that makes sense. But if it's not, you might be better off using a word that other people are more used to. And I mean, if you really want to use that word, don't use it somewhere where it's surprising. Like, you can build up to that word, and in the previous sentences that come up, you can talk about the ideas that that word represents. And then, like I said earlier about varying sentence length, you say like, this is then whatever that big word is, just period. And it's a short sentence and it just brings the point home with that big word. So that's one way to keep it if you don't, if it doesn't work in that sentence.
Yeah, building on that, one of the coolest things about writing a note is that it makes a large body of research very accessible. And that was what I thought was kind of cool about it, is that, yes, it's for the legal community. It's also for whoever, you know, wants to learn about this topic. So if you're starting fresh with a legal topic that you know nothing about and you're reading someone's note, you're already learning a lot. You don't want to have to turn to a dictionary. So if you're reading and you hit this word and, like Louis said, you're like, what does that even mean? It's going to take you out of the story and it's going to distract you from what you're really trying to focus on.
Good. All right, perfect. When you were going through and writing a note or editing a note, what kind of audience do you think that the writers should keep in mind? This is kind of building on a very similar point as that. Like, obviously, should they be attempting to explain everything from the very ground up, or kind of where should they kind of be able to take like an assumption of understanding from?
Personally, I think the more explanation you have, the better it is. I'm a big fan of using commas to offset an explanation. There are some exceptions, obviously, like you don't need to say what the Constitution is, but usually, like, when people start a sentence or start a section in a note about the First Amendment, they say the First Amendment to the US Constitution says this. And then from that general principle, they start talking about the issues that their note talks about. And, you know, most people know what the First Amendment says, but sometimes it's useful to just kind of bring it home and add context to what you're saying. And again, with the story part, you don't want someone, like Abigail said, you don't want someone to have to use a dictionary or use another tool to understand what you're trying to say. Within reason, you want to give as much explanation as you can.
It can also just make it more powerful. Like, for example, my note had to do with the Civil Rights Act, and my advisor and some of my editors suggested that I include, you know, the background of the passage of the Civil Rights Act. And at first I was like, everyone knows about the Civil Rights Act. Why would I add that in? But ultimately it ended up making my overall narrative more compelling, because having that background in mind as you read the rest of the note kind of puts you on the right track.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Obviously, you kind of want the reader to understand what you're saying without having to flip back and forth to, oh, I have to go look at the Constitution. Oh, I have to go look at the Civil Rights Act. I have to go look at this, that, the other thing. It makes a lot of sense kind of when you're going through and kind of speaking onto the points that you made earlier. It kind of presents a narrative as you go along and read, and you're kind of building up each point as you go along that ultimately leads to the argument that you make. I guess kind of a little bit of a different question. A lot of our writers, we go through a few different stages of editing as it goes along, but they do develop a rough draft 1, a rough draft 2, and a final draft. And after you look at something for a very long time, it's kind of natural to get a little bit desensitized to what you're reading, what you're writing, and, you know, often what you're editing about. What are kind of interesting, I guess, tips or tricks or things to keep in mind for our writers as they go through and they're editing something that, you know, they're maybe like starting to get a little bit, you know, not as happy to edit initially?
Like I said before, as silly as it sounds, reading it out loud does help. And it seems like an annoying thing to do, but you find things. And beyond finding just actual sort of errors, if you're reading something out loud and you hit a bump, like Luis mentioned before, you notice. So just do it. If you're getting sick of reading it over and over again, just try doing it out loud, see what it finds you. And then, like Luis said before, if you read through even the first sentence of each paragraph going through, rather than reading the entire thing, you should still be able to see what the general premise of your note is about just from those first sentences. So that could be a useful exercise as well.
Yeah, for the record, like when we do our final reviews of every piece, we read them out loud. It takes us hours, but it's the best way to actually find all the errors. When you look at your own piece, I think the best way to look at it is like to look at it from the viewpoint of someone who doesn't agree with you. You look at every sentence and say, okay, is someone who doesn't agree with me going to attack this argument that I make because I didn't draw it out clearly enough? Or did someone who would someone who hates me read this it and not understand what it referred to? And if the answer is no, they won't understand that. You need to switch that it or they or whatever pronoun you use with the thing that it actually, the antecedent to the pronoun. And you just look at it with the most critical eyes that you can and treat it like a game. The more that you find, the better off your note is. It's a little bit of a scavenger hunt at that point.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I totally see what you're saying there. We actually have a question in chat from Alex Rivera. I'm gonna summarize it as it touches a lot on kind of what we've already discussed about like word choice and diction, especially when writing about complex legal jargon. But kind of the core of the question is, especially at our level of writing where we're not necessarily as familiar with the overall legal concepts of which we're writing, we're kind of gaining this understanding ourselves and effectively teaching ourselves this information. When should we really focus on using formality of like certain legal writing or certain legal phrases versus just putting more weight on making a note about a complex topic more accessible?
I think that what I've found, if you can avoid legal jargon, you should. And if you can't, you should define it. One of the first things that my legal writing professor said to me is, I never want to see Latin. I never want to see Latin in your writing. There's just usually no reason for it outside of what Louis said before about showing off. And it's not really that much showing off if you could just look it up on Westlaw, just say what you're trying to say. And I think that you feel like you need to be doing more when you first start to kind of set yourself apart in terms of the formality or the sophistication of the language that you use, but it's a lot harder to write clearly than it is to write big words. So take on the challenge and really think about when you were doing your research. I'm sure you read a lot of articles. I'm sure you read a lot of notes. Which ones were your favorite? Was it the ones that used a bunch of big words that you had to read the sentence 4 times before you could move on to the next sentence? Or was it the one that made sense right away? Because it's probably the latter.
Yeah, I'm not going to repeat that because Abigail put it very well. I'll just add that I'm in a legal writing workshop right now, one of my classes, and we spent some time looking at an opinion by Justice Sotomayor. I think it was either her or Kagan, and she's like the queen of writing simply. She makes sure that every sentence flows with another. She starts with, she'll talk about a case, and then the next sentence will start. In that case, we decided the rule that, I don't know, the sky is blue. And then the next sentence says, that rule is good because X, Y, Z. and then XYZ make sure that this happens. And everything, like, she takes one key idea from the sentence she just wrote and she puts it as the subject of the next sentence. So just make sure that the reader isn't left behind. They don't have to imply anything. They don't have to infer anything from the last sentence, and everything just flows. And nothing is too complicated. I mean, the law is complicated enough, and the whole point of you writing a note is to explain it to other people. So the simpler it is, the better it is.
That's great to hear. And we kind of have one more, I guess, fundamental question about writing before we're going to open it up to the floor. So for those of you out there, that means start coming up with more questions besides the ones you already submitted. But kind of a very technical question that we see come up very often is that law review notes are often divided into multiple sections, subsections, and within those multiple paragraphs. We really like to see work that flows, work that overall makes sense, and work that kind of provides a very clear roadmap about where it's headed. How should authors really focus on not only transitioning between individual paragraphs within a single section, but also transitioning between larger subsections where they may be transitioning from one part of their argument to introducing a new topic that is equally fundamentally important to their argument, but kind of starts off as something completely different?
The way I look at this is it kind of happens at two stages of the writing process, two separate stages of the writing process. I really like Abigail's idea of expanding and shrinking, so I'm just going to keep using that. Like, so when you start doing your research and you start outlining, you're expanding everything. And when you're starting to write about everything you're outlining, you're expanding everything. And you should treat each single section on its own by itself. And it's almost like a mission. You have a quest. You're trying to come out of one section having explained one or two key things about that section that the reader needs to know before they move on to the next section. And they're kind of like check boxes that are separate from each other that you need to make sure that they're done when you're in your expanding era. When you get back to shrinking, you then need to make sure that in between those sections, the ideas still flow. And because you've already done each section, all you really need to do is just, like pepper in references that prepare the reader to get you to the next spot. So that happens in your shrinking. So you don't have to feel overwhelmed about doing everything all at once. You do it when you're expanding and then when you're shrinking. So just make sure you do that, and I think your notes will be fairly clear.
Also a big fan of roadmaps. When I was writing mine, I definitely had the experience of, okay, I think I'm doing a good job of explaining what I'm trying to get across in each of these sections, but one of the biggest edits that I got throughout the writing process was these are standing alone. And that's, I think, a natural thing to happen when you first start writing, because when you focus on part one, you're focused on part one. When you're focused on part two, you're focused on part two. And the way to connect them is making sure you're kind of holding the reader's hand by providing a roadmap at the beginning of each section or at the beginning of each subsection, and just kind of checking in with the reader throughout the piece to make sure that it's clear why you are where you are and where you're going.
Great, thank you so much. All right, now we're going to open it up to the floor. So if you have a question, just feel free to raise your hand. I have some already, but okay. So one of our first questions we have is also from Alex. This is a little bit of a specific question, so feel free to answer it however you can. How do you see the process of researching, writing, and editing law review notes evolving in the future as AI continues to emerge? And I guess not only does this, I guess we could broaden this a little bit, not only specific to AI, but what is it like? What are things that we should keep in mind, especially for those writers that are focusing on more contemporary topics that are much more subject to change, and how they can kind of keep that in mind, especially when they're trying to, make a conclusion or make an argument on a very hotly debated legal topic? And how can they kind of approach the flexibility and the fluidity of that situation?
I can't really chat GBT. I don't know enough to get into that realm. But in terms of things that are changing as you go, that's something that happened to me actually. There was a decision that changed a whole chunk of my writing as I was going, and that's going to happen if you're talking about things that are very current. Make sure you keep checking. That is one important thing. I also think that it's important to, of course, be passionate about what you're writing, but in the same vein, don't be completely stuck in your conclusion before you start. As you write, sometimes you change your own mind, and I think that's a good thing. I think that it's inevitable that as you write and as you research, you're going to develop a fuller understanding of your topic, and you're going to find nuances that you didn't consider before. So I think that even if your conclusion comes later than you expect it to, don't panic. I think it just means that you're really putting the thought into it that you need to be putting into it. I'm not sure if that was really the question that you're asking in terms of technology, but happy to answer additional questions as well.
I haven't used ChatGPT too much, but I think it's only as good as the inputs you give it. Like, I think some people have tried to use it for housing contracts. I think I've seen examples of someone trying to use ChatGPT to make a lease. Like, the instruction is like, please make a standard lease for X term, this much rent in Tennessee, or I forget, like a specific county. And for that, it's like decent. I think the more complex task you give it, the harder it will be. So I don't know how good ChatGPT is at crafting arguments and trying to come out with, trying to understand something complex, especially when our note is like your argument and how you think of a specific issue. I have seen it in my legal writing class. There was a day where we were trying to look at different examples of memo writing. And we saw a really good memo, and we talked about all the reasons why it was good. And then we were given another memo, and we were supposed to talk about all the ways in which it was bad. And our professor revealed to us after the fact that she had gone ChatGPT to write that memo. So, and she had given it the same prompt like 10 times and had to specify what she wanted out of the prompt in those 10 times, and it still didn't end up as good. So, I mean, all this to say, like, it's probably good in terms of trying to get a first draft in, but in terms of getting something polished, that it's a final result that is going to be read by humans, it's probably not the best thing by itself, at least now.
No, thank you. Kat's the step away from another club commitment, but we really appreciate you talking with him there. We're going to keep things going as we open things up. Obviously, I'll throw a disclaimer in there as you guys proceed to rough draft 2. We don't really expect you guys or want you guys to be plugging things into ChatGPT and copy pasting them into those Word docs. Please don't do that. But I mean, both of our fine guest speakers have pointed out, it's a really useful tool for informational or educational purposes. If you're trying to better understand a nuance or a side thing in your topic that you don't really understand at this point, it might point you in the right direction so long as you're actually getting good instruction. But I do think actually Alex's question brings up a great kind of avenue of thought. How do you guys, both as writers or as editors, approach the originality standpoint and how you engage with your sources? Because we've had a lot of writers encounter, I think, very fine or very interesting law review sources or other legal argumentation, but then have kind of struggled to differentiate or kind of distinguish their own arguments within it. What are some like pitfalls versus like strategies to recover you've seen from writers in terms of keeping your own argument kind of original at this stage in the process? If that makes sense. You got on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one way to do that, like I said before, is to really pay attention to the nuances. And I think that with these hot topics, you're not going to be the first person who ever talked about this. So I think trying to come out with a completely out of the box, quote unquote, rock star solution may not be the best course of action. I think that there's a way to be original without completely trying to come out of left field as much as you humanly possibly can. I think that having slight distinctions can sometimes be a lot more important than you think in terms of your argument, because the reason why a lot of arguments have come up before is because they're probably good arguments. So if you're finding even a small distinction that you disagree with, or that you can really expand upon, or even come at it from a different direction and relate it to new topics or new cases or modern times, I think that that's stronger than saying, how do I completely reinvent the wheel?
Yeah. So a couple of things, right? Like to begin, like plagiarism is really bad. So you don't want to just quote, you don't want to just write down a thought without attributing it to whoever had that thought or whatever professor had that thought. But a way around it is attributing it to that professor and placing yourself in the discourse. I've seen a lot of people say that, professors X, Y, and Z argue that this is the right way to look at it. However, professors ABC say that, there's also a different way of looking at it. But I contend that the best way to look at it is this. And in terms of originality in between those, I mean, Abigail's right. Like, you're probably not going to be Einstein when you're trying to talk about these things, and that's okay. What I see happen usually is people will nitpick. I mean, in crafting their own original conclusions, people will nitpick the good parts of solution A and solution B to make a solution C. I mean, it's probably not that original to just say solution A is right or just solution B is right. But I think the most original ones are saying, well, here's a solution C that takes the best of A and B, and C is the best because, and then you talk about all the reasons why it's the best. That's usually the way that I see people still be original while attributing things to the people they should be attributed to.
Wonderful. That's an excellent response. Thank you. I know it's coming close to 6:50, so really, if any of you who had to leave early, if you have a question right now, we'd be really happy to take it, explore it in any direction you want. Just open it or forever hold your peace. Awesome. Okay. Well, in that case, next line of question, you both are very accomplished writers yourselves, both as editorial members at Fordham Law Review, and a variety of other writing pursuits you've had. In the law review format, in each of your articles, if you could briefly describe to us what a major roadblock or challenge you encountered in your own research process, in your own drafting, editing process you encountered, and kind of what steps you took to overcome that, in a sense. If you have nothing on hand right now, we can kind of point a different direction, but we'd be happy to kind of hear your thought process there.
Personally, my biggest problem is starting. I think someone described it to me as someone described procrastination to me as just the fear of failing or doing something wrong. So you just don't even start to begin with. So there's no chance of failing. But then because you procrastinate, you get closer to failing because you have nothing and it's almost due. So that's always like the impending crisis for me. But at some point, I just like put some music on, listen for a few hours and just write, like just let my fingers type without thinking or without criticizing what I'm writing. I tend to be a perfectionist where I want every single sentence to be right and perfect as I go along, but that takes so much time. The most fun part, honestly, is just to get it all done, like get your outline, expand your outline, and then where it really counts is the shrinking. Like you make sure once you have all that gibberish in, at least you're done. Like you can at least, like you're done early and then you spend the next week or whatever time you have left just perfecting it. So that the biggest challenge for me is starting, and I'm trying to get past that.
Abigail, did you have anything to share there? Or?
Yeah, I relate to that. Shocker, we're both perfectionists, but I feel the same way, where it feels like this overwhelming, huge undertaking that let me do everything else I can possibly do, and then I'll do that. And that's just, you're just going to continue making yourself anxious, and it's just going to be worse in the long run. So sometimes you'll surprise yourself if you just let yourself expand and you just let yourself do your thing. Sometimes you'll come up with something that's better than you expect. And then from there, you can clean it up and you have a starting point. And I think that relating to that, one of the biggest issues that I had was a sort of imposter syndrome type of thing, where every sentence that I wrote, I was like, I hate it. You have time to fix it. And I think that you are in control of your own attitude. So I think conceptualizing it as something that you are capable of doing and that you have the privilege of doing is going to make it a lot easier for you to do it than thinking, oh my God, how am I going to do this? I'm not smart enough for this. Because that's within your control. So start from a standpoint of, this is a really cool thing I get to do and I'm going to do it, and then do it.
Also, real quick to add, for those of you that like to procrastinate and are good with it because it's been successful so far, I felt that way for a little bit, where like I'd wait until the night before and I'd pull an all-nighter. This is as recently as last year. I'd pull an all-nighter for my first draft because it was due the next day. And I think after I turned it in, damn, that was pretty good. That like made so much sense. I made some really good arguments. And then I get comments back and I was like, oh shit, I should have realized that there was this many issues in everything that I wrote. And that's the other problem with procrastination, is that you don't get that second look to really find the mistakes in what you wrote. So definitely start early. Even though you think what you wrote is good, like the night before, it's probably not. So just give yourself time to look at it again.
Well, excellent. Thank you. We appreciate the straightforward advice there. I think that's a lot of what our writers kind of struggle with, and it's relatable. Me myself, I think I've done multiple times with draft submissions. I've been up all night and it's not conducive to work and I think the feedback process. Again, if we have any last questions from writers, I know it's very close to wrapping up. If you guys have any thoughts, anyone from eBoard has any specific questions? But if not,
One, what's the first thing that you write down when you're starting something out, like, and you're running like an outline, you're trying to, is the page, what's the first thing you write? The first section you write.
did you catch that?
Did you
No.
say what's the first section that you write?
He's asking, when you start the writing process, what's the very first thing you put pen to paper, I guess you would say? In terms of your ideation process, or you're kind of getting there. Is that you're referring to rough drafts, or you are referring to like topic like ideation?
Combination of the two, maybe more, maybe the ideation.
Okay, so like, yeah, very first thing, like conceptualizing a note or kind of reaching that topic process.
I think my first step is usually to get an outline together, and that is through research. And that's a lot of quote dumping onto a Word doc. And the advice I usually give is, once you start running into the same sources over and over again, you know you're done with your research, because there comes a point where everyone's pointing to the same things, or they're going back to something you've already looked at, you know you're done. Once you get to that point, then you're just trying to get that all distilled and synthesized onto one page. I don't know if anyone's ever successfully just gone from prompt to writing directly. I think the outline is really important. So definitely get an outline before you get something onto a page, I think.
And then like Luis was saying, even your outline, legal writing is weird because when you start, you have to start first with what everyone else has already written. I'm a big fan of Westlaw folders personally. You can just kind of take, I don't know if you guys use Westlaw or if you're familiar with the folder system, but it's another way of just taking all the quotes that you think are good for you, getting them on paper. And then once you have all of those concepts and all of that prior research, that's when you can organize that. And then from that, you distill it into how you want to write what you're going to write.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you for kind of giving guidance there. On this moment, though, we think we'll be wrapping things up in terms of Q&A. Again, we appreciate all the questions you guys brought. And of course, thank you, Luis and Abigail, for taking time out of your very busy days to kind of talk with undergrads here and kind of give you guys give us a little mirror look, I suppose, it's the higher level process for law review writing. We really appreciate your time and flexibility. We'll be sending out resources to all of you regarding writing that Luis and Abigail have done in the past. If you guys are curious about seeing what Fordham Law Review publishes, it's a really high level of writing. Well, we're really proud of what we do here. There is a huge gap, I would say, in terms of skill, competency, and levels of arguments. So I would really recommend all of you, well, maybe not, your writing's not to be at that level, and that's completely fine. It's definitely worth reading. We'll definitely be putting in contact information. If you guys have any questions you really had, you didn't feel answered tonight, reach out to the e-board and we'll try and put you guys in touch. But if not, thank you so much again. Have a wonderful night. We're gonna touch on a few more club things here, but we'll let you guys go.
Of course, thanks everyone. Yeah, don't hesitate to reach out.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having us. Good luck, guys.
Bye.
Yeah.